the good life. This afternoon, our theme, as it was this morning, is the historical human quest for freedom and justice. I know that many of you probably heard Mr. Thomas Jefferson when he spoke out eloquently regarding his views on liberty, on the equality of all religions, and his vision for a kind of utopia in America. Our first panel member today is Sir Thomas More, portrayed by Bob Bennett, who is our college president. Born in 1478, Sir Thomas was the son of a very eminent British lawyer. So like Jefferson, he too was born to privilege. He was very well educated, a deeply religious man who struggled all his life with questions of morality. One of his most famous struggles, which he, as you will learn, did not win, was with Henry VIII, the King of England, over the role of the Catholic Church versus the Anglican Church. He is also very well noted for his famous work, Utopia, which he coined the word for, and which he published as a book in 1516. I want to remind you that the word utopia means nowhere. Please remember then, as we hear our panelists today, and they explore their own personal quest for freedom and justice, whether they believe those values do exist in only utopia. Please welcome Sir Thomas More.
Good afternoon. In about 7 minutes, I'm supposed to describe the life of a very complex man. This will be difficult to do, and I think if I'm going to describe myself, I need to explain a bit about the period in which I lived. If you remember, when I was introduced, I was born in 1478 and died in 1535. It was a very exciting time in the history of Western man. If you think about it for a minute, you know that we were exploring the New World, that science was taking on a new meaning in terms of knowledge, that the Catholic Church was being challenged as the only religion for Western man, and that kings were beginning to understand how wealthy they could become through exploration. And as a result, they began to challenge the very existence of the church itself. It was in those times that I was born. You also understood that I was born to wealth. My father was an attorney, a barrister. So for that, he was able to give me an opportunity to learn, to be in the presence of learned men, afforded a college education. I went to Oxford. So I had the privileges of wealth, and I think I took advantage of them. I was a student from a very young age. I enjoyed the study of Greek and Latin and spoke both well. In fact, I struggled with that concept because my knowledge of Latin made it possible for me to understand the church and the importance of the church. And for a time after I finished college, I thought about becoming a cleric. I struggled with this because my father said, you know, you need to be a man of the real world. And he was a little suspicious of me studying Greek because he thought it was frivolous. There were frivolous ideas with those ancient Greeks. Well, I went with my father's wishes, and I became a lawyer, and I entered the world of politics, became elected to Parliament. I think I'd begun to form a philosophical base with respect to how man treated each other at that time. And my first struggle with my faith and what I believed was important in terms of our political figures came to bear. I felt that princes, kings, oftentimes pursued wealth at the expense of the common man, or man in general. And too often I was offended by what I saw kings do in terms of gaining this wealth. I took offense, for example, when Henry VII passed what I thought was a frivolous tax, and I let him know it. was not a smart move on my part. My father was threatened with jail, and I thought my time as a politician was over. Fortunately, King Henry VII died shortly afterwards, and I had the opportunity then to be blessed with a new king, King Henry VIII. As I told you, many things were happening in Europe at that time. There was a young king in France, there was a young king in Spain, and there was this glorious, charismatic King Henry VIII. I was enthralled with this man. I thought he would be, perhaps, an enlightened despot. But as I told you before, I was concerned about princes and their desire to obtain wealth, and I had this problem with chivalry, because I felt that most of chivalry was nothing more than a man's attempt at taking advantage of other people and then giving some false reason for their meanness to other people. King Henry did not disappoint me in that respect, because almost immediately he began war on France and then in Scotland. I was pragmatic enough that I did not take offense publicly, but I did have some friends who later became known as humanists. These friends are also quite famous. Desiderius Erasmus is a man that came to England and studied with me, and he too had some of the same feelings about war and the viciousness of war. In fact, I was so offended by war that I did not like the idea that people would hunt for sport, because I felt that when they hunted for sport, they were simply training people. When they learned to kill an animal, then they could easily move to killing of human beings. I didn't make that known too publicly in light of the king's great interest in sport and hunt, but I wrote about it on several occasions. I hoped for quite a number of years that King Henry would become enlightened. I was very hopeful at first, because he allowed me to say things with respect to the importance of the common man. I later held back as I saw him changing his mood as he tried to work through this business of providing an heir to his throne. I also looked at the papacy, and I was offended at Gregory II and the fact that he, as a pope, would take a position, in fact, lead an army to defeat another power. As a result, and as was explained earlier, in 1515, I wrote a book called Utopia. I thought there had to be a better world. And I was hopeful in this day of enlightenment, with so many things happening, that we could move toward that. And so I wrote a book talking about an imaginary civilization, relatively small group of people living on an island, in which all people were equal, and they had equal wealth. In fact, it might have been called a forerunner of some communistic thinking. Some people would have accused me of that. But I felt that there was basic good in all people, and if given an opportunity to read and to study, they would be able to live together harmoniously if they worked hard. In fact, I even scheduled a day for them. I would say that there would be 6 hours of work in a day, 3 hours in the morning, then we would have a nice dinner, and then 3 hours in the afternoon, and would probably be in some way related to agriculture, because I really felt that there was something basically very good in working in the land. Men and women both would work. Men and women both would be educated. And I was very careful to say that there should not be any distinction as far as people were concerned with respect to clothing. They would all wear the same kind of clothing. I did not want classes in society. I took offense when kings would talk about, we now in England are better than those in France, when I believed that all of these people were fellow Christians. And we should never at any time allow one group of Christians to fight and take advantage or think themselves superior to another. I think those ideas got me in trouble. Henry VIII, as you probably know, was having problems with his first wife because she bore him no son. And he felt very strongly that he should have a son. He may have been bored with his wife, and he used all kinds of excuses why it really was not an appropriate marriage anyway, because after all, his wife had been married to his brother earlier, and he found a passage in the Bible which would have explained that that was simply a sinful thing to do. So he wanted that marriage annulled. There was another reason, of course. He had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, and he thought perhaps he could have a son. When it came to that time in his reign, I was Lord Chancellor, highest office in England other than the king. He and I were close in one hand, but I always recognized that he had the power, and he would do whatever was necessary to use that power if in fact people got in his way. So as a result, when I was invited to the wedding, I simply said, no, I'm not well. In fact, I said I wanted to I want to be absolved of this office. And as a result, I knew I was out of favor with the king. At that time, there wasn't a great deal said, but I know that the king wanted my blessing. I wasn't able to give that blessing because I felt that the church was responsible for spiritual and moral matters. And if we allowed the kings to take that responsibility away, then there would be no spiritual guidance. There would be no ethical guidance for all of the kings of Europe. And all of the wars that I abhorred so much would even be worse. There would be nothing to control those people. But I also believed in the law. And I thought, if I say nothing in terms of why I object to this marriage, and I ask, and I don't even say this to my family, that in fact they cannot accuse me of any wrongdoing. Unfortunately, I was wrong. I was given an opportunity. First of all, I was sent to the Tower, and I stayed there for 18 months. And eventually they trumped up some charges, and I was brought to trial. I denied. I said nothing with respect to the charge. And they were desperate, and then they had said in prison I had said something, and they asked a man by the name of Richard Rich to lie and say that I had in fact been dishonorable to the king. Well, I tried not to say anything, and it got to the place when they said that, all right, they were going to send me to death, and it was going to be a very violent death. I was going to be quartered and then disemboweled, and then have my body strewn throughout London with my head on a pike. Well, I was a brave man, but quite honestly, this was a very scary thing to face. Frankly, I think that my time in the Tower was not as bad for the 18 months because part of the time I had my books and I studied. I had a chance to see my family on a couple of occasions. But when it became so apparent that I was going to die, I did speak, and I spoke only to the fact that I thought there was an illogic in the fact that the king would have all power. I think behind it all, I was concerned about the ethics of any man who would have that much power. And even though there were things about the church that I did not support, I felt this overriding power of the church was important to all of the kings. And I did not want that lost because I felt the world would be worse. As a result, I was condemned to death. And I went to the Tower, but the king, perhaps having some kind of a guilty conscience, said I would not be drawn and quartered and be disemboweled. I would only have my head chopped off. So I went to the Tower, and I, of course, had to put my head before the block. And right before I had my head removed, I did speak to the axeman and said, please, my neck is short, make it quick. I think the king was wrong. Erasmus said about me that I was a good man, a man that had never hurt anyone, did not have evil thoughts about others, and cared very much for the common good of all men. And even though I died an ignoble death, I think that I was right about men and women. In fact, many, many years later, in 1862, the Catholic Church recognized the contributions that I had made to mankind and to the freedom of all men, and they canonized me a saint. So I think in the long run that my philosophy with respect to the rights of man were correct and appropriate, and even though it was a terrible death, I am proud of the fact that I held to my ideals and offered an example for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Our next panelist is William Wilberforce, also an Englishman, portrayed today by Norm Gissel, a local attorney. Born in 1792, Mr. Wilberforce became a member of Parliament at age 22, and he served there most of his life. He had two goals in life: one, to reform the morals of England, and two, to end slavery. While we may question the success of his first goal, he eventually was successful in his second. Slavery ended in the British Empire in 1833, just 3 days before Mr. Wilberforce's death. Please welcome Mr. William Wilberforce.
We each have 8 minutes to give our presentation. Sir Thomas More was well known among us. He's not a contemporary of mine, but he was known as a windy fellow. I was, like my colleague in time at least, Thomas Jefferson, I was born wealthy and died poor, unlike modern politicians who come to office poor and leave rich. I was 22 when I first entered the House of Commons from the electorate of Hull. I was very fortunate not only to have good parents and a good family and a good Christian upbringing, but I also got to attend St. John's College in Cambridge. I did not go to Trinity College, which was forever immortalized as the best of those institutions by the education of Isaac Newton. However, St. John's was a good college in those days and remains so today. I dedicated my life to politics as I came from a wealthy merchant family. Early on in my time in the House of Commons, I entered into a religious conversion and I became a Methodist as opposed to an Anglican. And in so doing, I forever gave up any promise of ever being a political leader of England and ever becoming a member of the leadership in the House of Commons. And as the evidence of the strength of my ideals, it was very promising, because I was one of the closest friends that William Pitt the Younger, who also was a contemporary of mine at St. John's College, he became the Prime Minister at a very young age himself, and I was one of his very personal friends. But because of my conversion to Methodism, I never could even think about achieving any higher office than the House of Commons itself. William Pitt and myself and my cousin Glanville sat under an oak tree after about 5 years of being in the House of Commons. And Pitt looked at me and he said, "Why don't you enter into legislation about this subject of slavery?" And it was at that point in my life that my life was completely and totally transformed. I was deeply religious, as I am today, of course. And I asked my God and my Maker, what should I do about this situation of slavery? And as was mentioned in the kind introduction that I just received, being a very simple man and a very God-fearing man, I had two simple goals. One was to banish slavery from the English Empire, and two was to raise the moral fabric of the English society. The proof that I would have that I had raised the moral fabric of the English society was by banning slavery. And I had to ban slavery by raising the moral fabric of English society. So in the sense that I was ultimately, and my colleagues were ultimately able to do away with slavery, was a proof that we had raised the moral fabric of the English society. You can't talk about me, and I can't talk about myself without talking very briefly about the institution of slavery, and I will just zip over the centuries of evil that slavery has meant in America, in world society. And I will say to you that at the initial stages of slavery, which are at the very fabric and at the very beginning of recorded history, Euripides, thousands and thousands of years ago, spoke against slavery. In fact, as Euripides is the first recorded sentiment ever expressed against slavery. But it was a question of conquest. If I conquered my neighbor became my slave. And that was the signature element of slavery for centuries and generations and generations and generations. The huge contradiction in slavery was that as a slave I owned a piece of property, but as I looked at my slave I saw a human being. And it was that internal conflict that caused so much opposition to slavery over so many centuries. Later, when the Europeans discovered Africa, as if Africa needed discovering, the people there knew where they were, it turned race-based, and a rancid, evil system became worse by factors of 10 because once Africa was discovered, it became race-based. And when a white man would look at a black slave, it was easier for him not to see a human being than it was when he looked at another white man. So the contradiction became unbearable, and the evidence of the mistreatment of slaves became unbearable. And finally, we had to do something, and I dedicated my life to this proposition that slavery must end in England. In 1892, it passed the House of Commons, a gradual reduction of slavery in the island of England itself. I was opposed to, I presented that legislation, but it was modified at the last minute by slavery proponents because of the issue of whether it should be gradual or not. I would invite your attention to Brown versus Board of Education. One of the authors of that famous Supreme Court decision says the worst thing that we did in that decision was to make it gradually implement it gradually. And so I believed in those days that it should be done immediately. Year after year after year, with singular purpose, I went to the House of Commons and urged upon the House of Commons the abolition of slavery. And in 1807, I was successful in banning slavery in England and the importation of slaves into England. And as I grew older and continued to fight for the banning of slavery throughout the British Empire, we were finally successful in 1883, and I received word of that 3 days before my death. One thing do I have some more time? 1 minute left? All right. What I like to do when I'm talking about historical figures, or history itself, you must know who my contemporaries were. One of my contemporaries, of course, was Thomas Jefferson and all of the founding fathers of America. Included in that is David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Edmund Burke, the great British moralist. Napoleon, unfortunately, was a contemporary of mine. And Abraham Lincoln, we keep forgetting. He was born in 1909 when I was 50. My political influence and my political position was essentially that I brought to British government and to much of government and to the idea of democracy that we must have freedom of all peoples in a democracy for that democracy to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilberforce. Our next panelist is Mrs. Josephine Butler, portrayed today by another NIC instructor, Mona Klinger, who is a speech instructor here. Mrs. Butler was born in 1828, and as a woman in Victorian England, she was remarkably brave enough to defend an unmentionable class of Victorian people, to wit, the prostitute. She was a very evangelical and deeply religious woman. She was married to her husband for 42 years, a very supportive and sympathetic husband. Because she was a married lady, it was felt that she was an appropriate person to speak about a highly taboo subject, sex. Mrs. Butler?
There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither free nor bond. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. It is such a delight to be before such a well-behaved audience. Normally, I speak before mobs of angry men, and I feel rather uncomfortable today speaking about my life, in that I lived by the ideal that women should practice 3 virtues, and they are humility, humility, and humility. But because we are here to talk about the most important issues of freedom and justice, I will today speak a little bit about my life with you. I was born in England in 1828, and I was lucky in that I was born to a family, a well-to-do, upper-class family. I was born in a time, you must remember this, ladies and gentlemen, where women were not educated, and yet I was educated. I was a writer, I became an orator. I knew 6 languages, and I spoke 4 fluently. I was born in a time when women were considered property. We had no legal rights. And yet, I was raised by the most enlightened, loving father, Sir John Gray, and I was married to the most wonderful, supportive husband, George, married 43 years, and I was treated as an equal. I was born in a society where slavery was acceptable, Mr. Jefferson, and yet my family were abolitionists. I was born in a society where the word sex was unspeakable, not in public, not in private, and yet I became a public, outspoken advocate for the most downtrodden of our society, the prostitute. Now, believe me, I did not set out to become the champion of the prostitutes. In fact, my realm of interest was the education of women. Ladies, are you taking your education seriously? I look around this room and here you are in college. Do you know that your education is what will make you truly equal? I challenge you today to make that education for yourself and for your daughters a most important priority. In my life, I was on my road to help women become better educated when something happened, the tragic death of my 3-year-old innocent daughter. I never fully recovered from that incident, and in fact I have a hard time talking about it, so I'd rather read to you from one of my writings. With the death of my daughter Ava, I became possessed with an irresistible desire to go forth and find some pain keener than my own, and to meet with people more unhappy than myself, for I knew there were thousands of them. I did not exaggerate my own trial. I only knew that my heart ached day and night, and that the only solace possible would seem to find other hearts which ached night and day, and with more reason than mine. I had no clear idea beyond that, no plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of some human misery and say, as I now knew I could, to the afflicted people, I understand too, because I have suffered. And so I went into the streets of Liverpool, and I found women dying of disease. They were the prostitutes. And I brought them home to my house to live with a family and to die with some peace and some dignity and some love, and knowing that our God is merciful. And we shocked society by bringing prostitutes into my home. Now some of you snicker. Prostitution is not about sex. Prostitution is about hunger. Prostitution is about slavery. Prostitution is about double standards. It is slavery of women's bodies for economic power. Perhaps you did not know this, but in mid-Victorian England, where I lived, you either married or you suffered poverty. Now, my belief is that all women are best off in a happy home environment, staying home with their children. But in mid-Victorian England, there was a surplus of women. Men had gone off to the colonies. Men had gone off to fight. Men now were not available for marriage. And women were not allowed to work outside the home. It was the time of the Industrial Revolution. Women no longer had cottage industries in order to help support themselves. And so the few jobs that were available to women, such as being governesses or maids, were few and far between. And so in mid-Victorian England in the 1860s, more than 83,000 women, ladies and gentlemen, were trying to stave off poverty and hunger by practicing prostitution. Ladies and gentlemen, economics lies at the heart of practical morality. So I was asked to lead the cause to repeal the Contagious Disease Acts of 1866. The government knew they had to do something about the venereal diseases that was sweeping Great Britain. 1 in 4 men was inflicted with a venereal disease. 1 in 4. And so in order to stop the venereal diseases, of which women were the ones who inflicted men, by the way, according to the medical community. Men did not inflict women. Women inflicted men. Men were simply weak. Women were harlots and fallen and immoral. The Contagious Disease Acts of 1866 allowed the police to take a woman off the street at their whim without any proof and test them for a venereal disease. They could put them in stirrups and a speculum inserted into them without any proof. And that was my life's work, to repeal the Contagious Disease Acts of 1866. I wrote, I gave speeches. In fact, I was often run out of town. My clothes were sometimes ripped from my body. I was bruised. I was bloodied. I was covered with flour and excrement. But God's mercy prevailed. And in 1872, the Contagious Disease Acts of 1866 were repealed. And I spent the remainder of my life working for freedom and justice, for the abolition of child prostitution. Our English gentleman would sell a child for no more than 5 pounds and ship them to Europe for the use of rich, degenerate men. We took our women from England and shipped them to other parts of Europe to be held hostage in brothels. We had houses in England, this did exist, for pedophilia, and I fought to close those places of immorality down. I will summarize my work in saying that I worked for justice and freedom. I was an outspoken advocate against gross sexual exploitation. I worked for common standards of morality for men and women. And for those who could not speak for themselves, I went down into the depths of Hades, and I would go down into the depths of Hades again, because I know that God would be by my side and we would emerge victorious. Ladies and gentlemen, God and one woman make a majority. I challenge all of you to do your part for justice and freedom. I thank you.
Thank you for those rousing words. Our next presenter will be Joseph Pulitzer, who will be portrayed by Nils Rosedal, a journalism instructor at North Idaho College. Mr. Pulitzer was born in 1847. Yes, this is the man for whom the Pulitzer Prize was named. In fact, he bequeathed the money that began the awards. Mr. Pulitzer did not have a happy early life. Born in Hungary, he rebelled at age 17 and ran away from home and tried to join first the Austrian, then the French, and then the English armies. None of them would have him. He was very scrawny, 6'3", very thin, very odd looking. He had a huge nose and chin that almost met, a huge Adam's apple, thick spectacles on very beady eyes, and dark, scraggly hair. No wonder they turned him away. Eventually, he emigrated to the United States. The U.S. Union Army was recruiting in Hungary and throughout Europe, and they encouraged young men to join their forces. Well, I'll let Mr. Pulitzer tell you the rest of his story. Mr. Pulitzer?
I just can't say thank you. All my life, the theme of my life with newspapers has been 3 words: accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. And this damn woman can't even pronounce my friggin' name right. My name is Pulitzer. Excuse me. To top it off, this rag that this college has produced spelled my name Weiser. I can't believe it. I've never been so insulted. I had to withdraw from publicly running my newspapers after I had only owned them for about 10 years because of nervousness. And I've done everything I could to try to not be nervous about my talk today, and then you guys give me this kind of a start. So let me try again. I didn't even want to immigrate, but the U.S. Army was the only army that would take me. They were desperate. She brought it up, so there I was. This is probably a retouched photo. They said that my chin nearly touched my nose. I had no upper lip, and an Adam's apple that I could trip on. So therefore, as soon as I could, I grew a very furry face to hide these features. And when I could, I got glasses that didn't bother me so much as far as my having to squint all the time. And I practically became presentable, especially once I started letting learned people know that I had a very good brain. I had boundless faith in myself. I was never really educated beyond reading, but as soon as I came to the United States and when I was finished with the service of 3 years in the Civil War, I went to St. Louis because of the giant German-speaking population that was in St. Louis. There I went to the libraries and studied law. In every minute that I had extra to me, I studied philosophy, and I got to know all these real learned men of St. Louis, even though myself, I was very homely and scraggly and penniless. I became very respected because nobody could beat me in chess. And I became to be valued for my knowledge of law, even though I had never been educated in law. These men really respected my ambition. They gave me odd jobs. Finally, I became a reporter for a German language newspaper in St. Louis. I saved every penny that I could. And before long, I bought that German newspaper. Then I bought another and another, and then I merged them. What made these papers successful for me was that I aimed them for people that came to America as I did, as common men, not aristocrats. And I tried to have these papers' philosophy be anti-big business and anti-slavery, and they became popular. At first, all the big business advertisers withdrew all their business from me, but they soon found that with the giant circulation of my newspapers, they couldn't afford not to advertise, and so they were forced to advertise in my newspapers anyway. I was very politically ambitious, and at age 22, hardly even speaking English, I was elected to the Missouri legislature. I was 3 years younger than the legal age to be a legislator, but they were so glad to have me that nobody ever exposed it. This was the proudest moment of my life, to become active in politics. In 6 years, I went to New York City, and I purchased the floundering New York World newspaper. It had a circulation of 15,000, which for a city of that size was tiny. Within 4 years, my methods got this newspaper from 15,000 to 200,000 in circulation. I did everything I could to promote the own image of the paper. I built the first real magnificent Sunday issue, incorporating entertainment, gossip, full features, many exposés, and one little feature that we all think of today that has made the Sunday papers famous. And here it is. It was the first comic strip in newspapers, and it was also the first use of color in newspapers. This became so popular that another very wealthy man who had inherited his money bought a newspaper in New York and started using my philosophies to compete with me. This man was named William Randolph Hearst, and he had the New York Journal. He was a very, very tough adversary for me. Our papers fought tooth and nail. We would present our stories very boldly in huge headlines and with lots of gossipy wording. It wasn't that they were untrue. It's just that they were presented very sensationally. This became expensive as we tried to outdo each other. And so we did a little bit of research, both newspapers did, and found that there was a cheaper type of paper available, but the problem was that it was yellowish colored. And so with this combined color of paper and with our sensational reporting, this became known as yellow journalism. Note, though, that this is not really a negative figure as it is considered today. Back then, it was just considered a method of trying to gain circulation. One of my philosophies was that a newspaper should have no friends. I did not ever want to be bought out by big business. And indeed, I had no friends. I had many enemies. I carried a gun. At one point, I had to shoot a man in self-defense. Another time, I was out buying tomatoes for my pregnant wife who craved tomatoes. And a man attacked me, and I pelted him with tomatoes and won the best of him. I had 3 campaigns which I was very proud of. One was the building of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, which no other newspaper would support. But the campaign that I was most fond of was the gathering of money for the building of the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. Nobody would contribute to this, and here we had this statue that was shipped to New York in parts, and it couldn't be put together because there was no pedestal to put it on. And so my newspaper published the name of every person that contributed even 1 nickel to the building of the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. My third conquest was that my paper very valiantly supported Democratic candidates for president. We often were successful, and we were very proud. However, many times I was crestfallen when that elected president would not follow through with what his promises had been that we had promoted earlier on. I had a philosophy that I stated many times, and let me read it to you. Put it before them briefly so that they will read it. Put it before them clearly so that they will appreciate it. Picturesquely so they will remember it. And above all, accurately so that they will be guided by its light. I was always disappointed that many of my newspaper employees didn't want to work 16 hours a day, such as I did. I thought that a person should be so involved with their work that work came first, family second. And my family life showed that later on. I thought a newspaper man should be so absorbed in his work that he should be a drinking man so he could drink his troubles away. What's ever happened? No one gets drunk anymore in the newspaper business. I was elected to the U.S. Congress from New York in 1886, but this lasted just 2 years because my own health broke down. I became blind and I became an invalid. I maintained control of my newspapers from my mansions in New York, South Carolina, Maine, and on the Riviera, and on my giant yacht, Liberty. I finally died in 1911 at age 64 aboard my yacht. I bequeathed hundreds of thousands of dollars to start the Pulitzer Prize Fund, of which today's papers, if you'll go out and read them, have the details for the 1996 prizes. I also donated $2 million to the Graduate School of Journalism of Columbia University and donated to many other charities. My estate was worth $18 million. Today, my family still owns a chain of 24 newspapers, 9 TV stations, many radio stations, and the St. Louis Baseball Cardinals. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. Only once in my career did my newspaper make a gigantic mistake, and that ended up benefiting mankind in the long run. There was a woman who was age 86 who had very peculiar religious philosophies, and she wrote about them and became very wealthy from the sale of her books. We thought this was atrocity, that she was crazy, and we encouraged her family to get control of her estate, and it went to court. Her family and the New York world lost the suit to this woman. Her name was Mary Baker Eddy, and in retaliation, she started the Christian Science Monitor newspaper. Her philosophy was a goal to never injure any man, but to bless all mankind. Well, her paper so far has won 5 Pulitzer Prizes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulitzer. We are now going to hear from another famous English woman. Her name is Christabel Pankhurst, and she's portrayed by Jeannie Batson, who is a student at North Idaho College. Born in 1885, Mrs. Pankhurst was vitally active in the women's suffrage movement in England. Among her other activities, with her friend Annie Kinney, she attended the House of Commons to ask Winston Churchill what he was going to do for women's suffrage. When he ignored their question, they raised a banner saying, "Votes for women." This became their rallying cry. They were immediately arrested. Thus began their violent actions on behalf of women's votes. Please welcome Ms. Christabel Pankhurst.
I'm having a wonderful visit here in America, and I hope all the young women enjoyed Josephine Butler's. The people like Josephine paved the way for me. I was born in 1885. You could say I was born into women's suffrage. My father first argued for election reform in 1868. He was Dr. Richard Pankhurst. And at that time, it was true. My mother stayed home. I had 3 sisters. She took care of the home, but paid very close attention to what my father and his colleagues were doing in trying to get election reform. And election reform meant a lot more than just women's votes. It also meant social reform for children's welfare, and that's how our family felt. Unfortunately, my father passed away in 1898, and so in 1903, my mother tried to join some of the more social groups of the older suffrage women, and she didn't believe that this was going to ever accomplish what we needed. So along with myself, my sister Sylvia, and some of my mother's followers, my mother Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union. And from 1903 to 1906, we tried the parades, we tried the rallies, We tried attending House of Commons meetings, letting them know that we were all there to become part of the law-making system, but not law-breakers. This got us nowhere. It was total inactive, no action from the House of Commons at all. So I guess you could say we declared war. We changed our motto from votes for women to deeds and not words. Numerous bricks were thrown through number 10 Downey Street. One gentleman that was a member of the House of Parliament was renovating his home, and unfortunately he never got to move into that home. I'm not saying who did it, but I think there was some involvement. Liquids were one of our favorite, where mailboxes were filled with liquids. We tried never to harm anyone in this. My favorite thing, I was thinking, what do men enjoy? And even in your day here, I see you have beautiful golf courses. And it was the same at that time, in 1908 and 1910. So I took it upon myself to make sure that most every golf course in England got carved up at night. Votes before sports. That directed a great amount of negative attention to my sister, my mother, and I. We were jailed numerous times. The House of Commons, the police, the officials, they weren't quite sure how to deal with us. Not many rules or regulations had been passed to this. And by 1911, things became, you would say, a bit warm for the women's suffrage movement in England. My mother decided to come to America to visit. Some friends had moved to New York. I went to Paris and continued to run the Women's Social and Political Union with the help of my dear friend Annie Kinney, who stayed in England. And while my mother was in America, she visited New York, she visited Boston. But I think you'll be surprised, the city that most impressed her was Seattle, Washington. She came back totally rejuvenated and felt she had never seen such equality in the way the men treated the women treated the men, high family values, the respect for the children, the thoughts of education for everyone. So I returned from England, and I would say we declared war before the Germans on the House of Commons. We decided that we must have the vote if we're going to get these social issues, education. Job equality certainly isn't a new topic. It's not something that you're just hearing in the 1900s or later 1900s. It was important then too. At that time, they decided, the House of Commons, they would jail for any activity in the women's suffrage movement. From 1911 to the end of 1913, over 1,000 women were jailed. We have all decided at that time to go on thirst and hunger strikes. I know hunger strikes probably everyone's aware of, but it takes the body very short time without any kind of liquid nourishment to be in a tremendous amount of pain. Well, they certainly couldn't let any of us pass away. It would give such great momentum to the movement. So they decided in 1913, by a very primitive and painful method, to force feed us by forcing 20-inch tubes down our noses and filling us with liquid so we wouldn't pass away under their care in Holloway Prison. All this did was really, it backfired on them because it filled our lungs and endangered our health even more. So they couldn't continue this. So they passed what they called the Cat and Mouse Act in 1913. And that meant if we were imprisoned and our health started to fail and there was any threat that one of us may pass away under their care, we would be released with instructions that we would be rearrested if we had any involvement in the women's suffrage movement. And of course, shortly after that, Britain entered the war in August of 1914, and the women's suffrage movement came to a screeching halt. We showed our patriotism by our work and our effort. We turned all our energy to the war effort. We certainly didn't want to become women that were slaves to the Germans. And after the war ended, many of the leaders, such as Winston Churchill, noticed our patriotism and the work, and it really swayed public opinion. And there was more support after the war. There was more, shall we say, social tactics used, and meetings and parades and gatherings. And then in 1918, the vote was allowed, but it was only allowed for women 30 and over. If you're under 30, you were too flighty and you certainly didn't know anything. That was a start, and only a start, because there were still so many other social issues to continue. So from 1918 to 1928, my mother continued to work for child welfare issues. My sister Sylvia worked for social issues because she felt that was more important. She was not really ever involved with many of the violent tactics. She thought socialism would end feminism. I myself continue to work for the women's suffrage to end for everyone over 21, and not just for women, because at that time a lot of men weren't allowed to vote if you weren't landowners and such. So in 1928, we were all, they passed further election reform acts, and the vote was open for everyone over 21 years old. That was the year my mother died. I was glad that she got to see her dream. I went on to become an evangelical Christian and worked until I passed away in 1956, and until my sister passed away a few years after that. She worked on social issues, especially for children's. She lived in the East End of London with the poor and the less fortunate, and she worked on those issues until she died, trying to bring more equality in that way. Thank you.
Our last panelist, and then we'll have a response from Mr. Thomas Jefferson with questions following from the audience. Our last panelist is a man who is probably best known to all of you. That's Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. A noble American, Dr. King was born in 1929 and, as you know, brutally assassinated in 1968. He was a man who, like Jefferson and like many of our other panelists today, have spoke out eloquently and memorably about his dream, about his vision for us all. Mr. King will now share with us his views on the historical human quest for freedom and justice. Dr. King.
I thank you today for allowing me to come and present some of my ideas and my life to everybody here. But before I begin, I want to say that I'm going to cut this down a little bit, because it's my belief that the only way to learn anything is to ask questions. And the more time you have to ask questions of each of us, the more you'll learn today. As was stated before, I was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the South when racism was running rampant. I was born to a father who was a Baptist minister, and my mother's father was also a Baptist minister. At age 15, I entered Morehouse College under a special program for gifted students. Received my bachelor's degree in 1948 at the age of 19. During my first bachelor's degree requirements, I was interested in law and medicine. But upon completing my Bachelor's of Arts, I followed my father's footsteps and entered the theology. I entered Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and received a Bachelor's of Divinity in 1951. Upon completion there, I moved on to Boston University, where I completed my PhD in 1955. While also in Boston, I met my wife and married her in 1953. Until my untimely death, we had 4 children. Upon completion of my formal education, I became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. I went there with just the hope of being a pastor and following in my father's footsteps. But a lady by the name of Rosa Parks changed that all for me. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to give up her bus seat to a white rider. In those days, segregation in buses was the same as it was everywhere else. If a white person came, a black person had to give up their seat. When she refused to do this, she was arrested and put in jail. Because of this, black activists in the city of Montgomery formed the Montgomery Improvement Association. Its sole purpose was to get the desegregation of buses or transportation within the city of Montgomery. Once they organized this, they asked me to become their leader. This was the turning point in my life when I became a civil rights activist and leader. About a year and a half after we began our battle against segregation, we succeeded, and buses were desegregated. I can't even speak. They were no longer segregated. After successful completion of this movement, I decided to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which gave me a platform to speak throughout the nation. Within this, we fought for equal rights for everybody. I think the one thing that I see nowadays is that the change has become that I was an activist for black rights. This is true, but I was also an activist for everybody's rights. Okay? And that's the one thing that I see that we've kind of lost in this whole thing. We've gone into races and religions and things. What my belief was that everybody had a right, not just black people, not just white people, not just Catholics, whatever you want to use as a definition. Okay. While in college, I became interested in the research of Gandhi, and in 1959, I was allowed to go and interview some of the people who were his followers during that day. I came away from that meeting deciding that nonviolence was the way to bring about change. Throughout the many years, like I said, I performed many nonviolent protests, sit-ins, demonstration, marches on Washington, things of those natures. But in 1964 was the culmination of all this, when I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But during my speech of acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize, I didn't accept it for myself, but I accepted it on behalf of all men who love peace and brotherhood. Because I didn't feel it was right for one person to receive the benefits of a whole group. As was stated, on April 4th of 1968, which wasn't that long ago, I was assassinated. One thing came to my mind when I was preparing this speech, and that was, or somebody had asked me, what would you say to the person who shot you today? Would you be angry at the person who did it? My belief is no, that I wouldn't be. The person was just an expression of society. Man, whether it be James Earl Ray or, as you've all seen on hard copy and everything else, who knows who it is now? It might be the government. But I don't believe he killed me. I believe fear of change killed me. People in those days were afraid of change, as in some instances we are today. And that is the underlying fact that did kill me. Okay. In closing, I just wanted to discuss, or just give you something that gave a little bit about who I was. Okay? I know you've all heard the famous speech, "I have a dream," and everybody has said it and everybody has used it in different terms to benefit themselves, which is great, because we all have dreams, regardless of who we are. So I'm going to go over the closing part of this speech. Okay? This will be the day when all God's children will be able to sing with the new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hills of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous peaks of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and every molehill in Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. I'd like to add one more today. Let freedom ring from the panhandle of North Idaho. When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of an old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're all free at last. Thank you.
We will now invite Mr. Thomas Jefferson to make some summary comments and reflections on our panelists' comments.
I commiserate with you for having to sit so long and not be able to speak, so I'll try to be brief. It's exciting to see that the social reform movement continues to grow and spread. You have a panel here of 5 social reformers and a newspaperman. I want to challenge just a few things that I've heard and comment on a few others. First, our generous host began, I think, erroneously by saying utopia means nowhere. No, and I wish that Sir Thomas More had corrected her. It's an irony, it's a pun of More's. The Greek word utopia can mean 2 things. It can mean nowhere, which is how the pessimists tend to look upon it, a kind of fictional world that we can never live in. Or, as I think More genuinely intended it, at least in one of his moods, it can mean eutopia, as in eugenics, good place. So the real question is, are you willing to read utopia in the most hopeful way? Or will you, like all of the pessimists of history, read it in a narrow way, as a kind of unrealizable dream? I'm not a complete utopian. I believe in the indefinite perfectibility of man, not infinite perfectibility. I think Mr. Madison was quite right when he said if men were angels, they would need no government. But how close can we come to utopia? Much closer than we have come. 2 of our panelists are proof that we need a high wall of separation between church and state. William Wilberforce could not run for political office in Great Britain because he was a Methodist. And the Methodists, although they were legally and socially tolerated, were not permitted to hold high office in his time. Think of that. Mr. Wilberforce's moral convictions, a question between himself and his God, were used by the state to prevent him from serving his own community. What could be more outrageous than that? And Thomas More, because he would not endorse Henry's adulteries and his search for a male heir, had his head chopped off. This is proof of what I said in the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, that a coercive state can make you a hypocrite, but it can never make you believe its doctrine. Henry tried to make Sir Thomas More accept the oath of allegiance and accept Henry as the supreme commander of the church in England. More's integrity prevented that. Henry wanted a hypocrite. He was willing to accept a hypocrite in replacement for the integrity of this great man. No, your moral and religious convictions are entirely off limits to the state, and you should never be rewarded, and you should never be penalized for your religious views. That's the glory of America. I take some small credit for the wall of separation that is your greatest national achievement. I salute Mr. William Wilberforce's attempts to outlaw the slave trade and slavery. I do remind you, as an American patriot, that Virginia was the first commonwealth in the world's history to outlaw the slave trade, and this a generation before your pioneering work in Britain. Probably your sort of moral courage would have brought that reform along much sooner, but the British people are not particularly susceptible to reform movements. I remember once Abigail Adams was in London and she wrote to me and said, "Mr. Jefferson, however are the British going to reform themselves?" I said, "Madam, it is not in their churches, it is not in their political structures that the British are to be reformed. No, it is in their gastronomic tracts. The sheer quantity of animal flesh that this people eats renders them insusceptible of civilization." I am a practical vegetarian and I urge it on all of you. Josephine Butler said 2 things which struck me deeply. First, she said, "Your education will make you truly equal." And nothing has ever been more truly said than that. Democracy is a very risky form of government. It's fragile. How do we keep the majority from being illiberal, from being unenlightened, from trampling on the rights of the minority? The only restraining mechanism in the free society is good education. I said, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect something that never has been and never can be in the history of the world. And I said, enlighten the people generally, and every form of tyranny, both of body and mind, will disappear like the fog when the sun rises in the morning. I wanted free public schools for all, because if you mingle rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, man and woman, Quaker and Mohammedan in one setting, there will be a natural rise in respect for the other, and there is a principle of equality that will set in. But if we all fragment ourselves into private schools, reinforcing our private dogmas and our separateness, then we can never enjoy the great gift of modern civilization, citizenship, equality. And she spoke of grief for her 3-year-old who died. She must feel some grief for my life, 6 children, 4 dead in infancy. And of the 2 who survived into adulthood, my beloved daughter Maria died when she was just 24 while I was president. And that was one of the great blows of my life. And I said to my oldest friend, John Page, others may give of their abundance, but I of my want have given half of all that I had. My evening prospects now hang on the slender thread of a single life. In a late letter to John Adams, I said, I can accept everything in the scheme of things. I believe this is a good world, a providential world. I steer my life with hope ahead and fear astern, but there is one thing that I cannot accept in God's order, my friend, and I ask you to tell me, what is the use of grief? Well, John Adams wrote back and said, grief prepares us for the grave, and it teaches us non-attachment, and it makes us humble, and other Calvinist nonsense of that sort. What is the use of grief? And why should we have to suffer it? Christabel Pankhurst reminds me of a letter between John Adams and Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was a sprightly woman who frightened me, frankly. She wrote a famous letter to her husband during the weeks before the Revolutionary Declaration of Independence, and she said, when, as I suppose, you create new constitutions and governments for the United States, I remind you to remember the ladies. Well, John Adams was a good man and a thoughtful man and a dear husband, but this, frankly, flummoxed him. He wrote back about 10 days later and said, I thought our problems were the British. We had no idea that we could anticipate a petticoat rebellion. And he said, I believe, ironically, rather than submit to the authority of the distaff side, Mr. Washington and all of our other patriots, I believe, shall fight. So I think the modern anachronistic response to his letter is, he just didn't get it. And finally, Martin Luther King and Joseph Pulitzer. I can dispatch Joseph Pulitzer quickly by saying, although I am the foremost advocate of freedom of expression in a free society, I am no friend to your tribe. You said, sir, that newspapers should have no friends, and I am glad to comply. When young and idealistic, I said, given the choice between newspapers without government and government without newspapers, I would not hesitate to prefer newspapers. But in 1807, as I was leaving the presidency, having been charged by your sort of fellow with every term of abuse and animadversion known to humankind, from slave rapist to atheist to free lover, I said in a private letter to John Norville, hereafter perhaps, every newspaper will voluntarily divide itself into 4 sections: truth, probabilities, possibilities, and bald lies. The 4th section, I said, will appear from time to time. The first, never. I said, the only thing I trust now in newspapers are the advertisements. We know they're lies. But still, I would protect you, because I believe the truth is great and will prevail in the long run when left to itself. And finally, Martin Luther King, it moves me deeply to share this stage with you. In my own time, you would have been behind the scenes, doing the work that enabled us to talk. I said, nothing is more certain in the book of faith than that this people must and will be free. But what strikes me as most extraordinary is that in your famous speech on the Mall in Washington, a city that I laid out, you said, Mr. Jefferson said, all men are created equal. And you said that was a promissory note. And for 200 years, we have demanded that that promissory note be redeemed, and every time we have tried to redeem it, it has been returned for insufficient funds. And now Mr. Jefferson and the founding fathers in America were calling in the promissory note, and we will wait no longer. Now, you know that I was a racist and a slaveholder and apartheidist, and that I honestly believed we could never be a biracial society. But I knew, too, that that principle, all men are created equal, was a kind of wave that was going to ripple through the world and tear up every tyrannical regime everywhere, our own included. So that is extremely moving to me, and what particularly interests me, and I hope we have a chance to discuss this between ourselves, is this notion that you had that revolution can come from non-violence. My own view was that blood is the stuff of human liberty. I said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. But your view is that passive resistance and nonviolence can be as revolutionary force as a pitchfork. And if that is true, humankind are on the way to benevolence, and not nowhere land, but the good land of utopia. Thank you.
I'm looking to you, Tony, for direction. I know this should last 90 minutes, but I know there are questions that people want to ask. All right. Anyone wish to ask questions of any of our panelists, and including, of course, Mr. Jefferson? Yes.
I'd like to ask Mr. Pulitzer what he would say to the local media.
Mr. Pulitzer, would you care to respond, and please repeat the question?
What do you say to the local
I'm sorry, we didn't hear. What would you say to the local media? Oh.
Please be.
For both newspapers, local papers, I would say accuracy, accuracy, accuracy.
Other questions? Yes.
For any of you out there, since government's come up a lot today with justice, with the prospect of the New World Order, would you consider that a threat to the sovereignty of the United States or closer to utopia?
Question is, would the New World Order be a threat to utopia or an enhancement to it?
Or a threat to the United States?
Threat to the United States sovereignty, excuse me, for any panel members.
You come over here.
I said at the time that I was living that I did not believe that the nation state, as it was developing, was appropriate, because I felt that when we distinguished among Christians and said one was greater than the other, that in fact we were creating great grief upon mankind. So I would guess when we talk about the New World Order, it would still seem important to me that we recognize the importance of all people, regardless of their faith, regardless of their nationality, and I think we should move forward.
Yes, you have a question over here on the floor? Can you get a video of Mr. Jefferson's performance earlier?
Well, keep in mind that video would have made me faint dead away. I thought I was really accomplishing something with my polygraph, which was 2 pens hooked to a pulley and a lever, which allowed me a fair copy of everything that I wrote. I said late in life, the book will be the great democratizer because it can be smuggled in tyrannical regimes all over the world. Imagine what I would have said had I seen the video, the facsimile, electronic mail. You now have it in your power to liberate the entire planet with the ideas of natural good and natural right. What connects Sir Thomas More and me? I would have disagreed with almost everything in his life, from his Trinitarian doctrine to his persecution of Protestant sects, but I would have admired this in Thomas More. We shared a commitment to natural law and natural right. Those aren't my ideas. Those aren't his ideas. They're the ideas that are written in the heart of man, and every technology that can get them into despotic regimes is a brilliant technology? I think the answer is see Tony Stewart afterwards.
In fact, the production was videotaped, and it will be in our library here on campus. Yes, question.
I would like to ask the ladies if you think women's lib has gone way too far by taking a woman out of the home. Most women work now.
Has women's liberation gone too far? Addressed to Mrs. Butler and Ms. Pankhurst.
I attend school. I work with my husband, our family business. I have two children. I have two children that attend college. I don't think so. I think it's in your personal way you treat it. I have a very full life. I enjoy every phase of it. I try to give everyone in my family. I try to be a good student. Tony could attest to that. I'm in his political science class. So I think some people will take anything too far.
I believe that the women's liberation movement has gone too far. I believe that there's no greater calling for a woman than to raise healthy, God-fearing children, and it's very difficult to do that if she's not in the home.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Question for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Do you think the world today has made great strides toward equality for all men?
To Dr. King, has the world today made greater strides toward equality for all men since his time?
I'd have to say politically, for the power of those who want advancement in our political organization, yes. But as far as seeing it from day to day on every man's face, I'd have to say no. If you look at, and this is turned to everybody. I mean, there are just as many ghettos where white people live as there are where there's black people, where Indian ghettos are. When you see that, and you see men who have the money, the power, and the time to do something about it, who don't because of fear of retribution of their colleagues, or because of fear of change, as I said before, I think you don't do justice to all men when a few men are afraid to have the power and the ability to make that change. So I have to say, no, it hasn't advanced a whole lot. It just looks a lot better on paper.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Jefferson, you're an advocate of public education. What's the single greatest thing threatening our educational system today, and how do we fix it?
I'm an advocate of public education. What is the single greatest threat to your public educational system in your own time, and how should you fix it? Well, let me say again, the earth belongs to the living, not the dead. I had a hard enough time sorting out the problems of my era. I hate to intrude upon yours. But I think the answer is a complicated one. I'll try to make it a very brief answer. It's easy enough to blame institutions, but truly, education is for those who have the thirst to imbibe it and the discipline to make it happen. There isn't anyone in this room who can't get, in some sense, as good an education at North Idaho College as you could get at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, or Stanford. Here and there, you might do better. But generally speaking, if you take full advantage of this institution, you will be one of the best educated persons who ever lived in the world. Go to the library and begin to read around it. And when you are exhausted, then begin to talk about the failure of the institution. So it seems to me that education reflects the cultural aspirations of the American people, and since Mr. Hamilton has entirely won you over, and you now are pursuing getting and spending with a kind of zaniness unprecedented in human history, it's not surprising that your educational systems are no longer very strong on Homer and Virgil and Montesquieu. So when you are ready to learn, I see many people who have shown once again today how brilliantly they're able to teach you.
Other questions? Yes, you have another one.
One for Mr. Pulitzer. With today's media and the portrayal of violence, do you feel there is still little good news reported in today's media?
Question for Mr. Pulitzer regarding the coverage of violence in the newspapers. Is there so little good news to report?
I think that if you read all of your newspaper, you'll find there is plenty of good news reported in the newspapers, but the reader has to want to read that. I think you'll find that most of your readers want to read other news than just good news, and that's why the newspaper gives the reader what the reader wants.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, then thank you, and hope that we'll see you this evening at 7 and for the rest of the week for our other presentations.